Chapter 11 of Homesick, a The Hobbit fanfiction, written by Margot_Kim, read aloud by SkyAsimaru. If you enjoy this podfic, you can check out the original story on Archive of Our Own. If you would like to hear more of my recordings or see some of my own work, you can find me through the pen and screen name of SkyAsimaru. Homesick, Chapter 11. Drogo's picnic was off to a marvelous start. That was what everyone said to Thorin, and he took their word for it. He had never been to a picnic before. The idea of looking at your food and thinking, gee, wouldn't this taste better if I was getting a sunburn while I ate it, was not a particularly dwarven one. Nor was the pitch like a normal meal, but instead of a table, there's your lap, and instead of chairs, you sit on a blanket, and instead of a ceiling and walls, ants. He'd eaten outside on the ground, but that had never been a circumstance to celebrate. Mostly it meant that he was homeless. Picnics, Primula had assured him, were better than that. Thorin was still waiting to see how. But a picnic was what Drogo was having for his birthday. And when Drogo had invited Bilbo, Bilbo had agreed to come. And for that, Thorin would don his big straw hat, slap off every ant that came his way, and fish the flies out of his beer. The beer was thus far the best part. It certainly wasn't Bilbo's presence. It couldn't be. Despite his promise, Bilbo was still not here. What did Thorin expect, he wondered, and strained his drink through his teeth. It had been an interesting week, in the same way that the Battle of 5 Armies had been an interesting afternoon, or Smaug had been an interesting guest. It was 5 days since their fight. Or maybe it was more accurate to say they were 5 days into their fight. On the Tuesday of Primula's visit, Thorin had slept in the main bedroom. Or rather, he had lain in bed staring up at the ceiling, hoping and dreading that Bilbo would join him, while also dreading and hoping that Bilbo would leave him alone. Bilbo had chosen the latter course of action. For a house that would apparently accept no guest, Bag End had plenty of guest beds. Bilbo made use of one. In the morning, Thorin had woken at dawn and found his way out to the kitchen. He made a pot of coffee and watched the sunrise. At 8, Bilbo was still asleep, or at least had not yet opened his bedroom door. So Thorin got dressed and left for his appointment with Mrs. and Mr. Turnpot without saying goodbye. He had a pleasant breakfast with the couple. They were both pushing a century, something Thorin normally had to remind himself was quite a feat for hobbits. Looking at them, 2 hobbits who looked like they'd started out the size of men before someone siphoned all the liquid out of them, Thorin remembered. They'd married 70 years ago, when Mr. Turnpot had been so poor that he couldn't afford a ring to put on his bride's fingers. They were still that poor, but Diaz had assured them that Thorin would be more than happy to forge them proper wedding rings. They held hands while they talked with him. They set each other for jokes and stories Thorin sensed were threadbare with years and use. Their relationship was so entrenched in them that there was nothing performative about it. Speaking with them was not like talking to two different people. It was like talking to one unit with two distinct parts. "What's your secret?" Thorin had asked, half teasing and half desperate.
"Good eating and vigorous love-making,"
Mr. Turnpot replied instantly, which for Thorin and Bilbo's relationship was only half a useful answer. Mrs. Turnpot slapped his hand.
"Communication," she said firmly instead. "You can't have too little of it." "Oh, shut up, you old biddy," Mr. Turnpot said. "You'll make us look bad in front of the boy." "Oh, shut up yourself, you daft bastard. You're shouting again."
It was worth considering, Thorin mused as he left them around 10, that divorce was not much of an option in the Shire. Dwarves rarely divorced themselves, but that was because so few of them married that they only did it if they were certain. If that certainty was wrong, though, they'd worked out a divorce clause for 1,000 contingencies before they had wedded. In the Shire, you could end a marriage, assuming you had money, time, a dozen reasons that the mayor thought acceptable, and the force of will to endure the scandal. As a result, hobbits preferred to separate early and often before the exchange of any vows or irreversible offspring. The Hobbit marriage contract was atrociously simple. My house is your house is my house. We're in this for life. It was a vow only possible because of what Thorin had discovered was somehow an appalling lack of both romanticism and pragmatism. Bilbo could say whatever he liked about the dwarven method, and Thorin would maintain that extensive contract negotiations could in fact be very romantic, thank you. But at least dwarves thought matters through. Hobbits seemed to glance at their watch, and then whatever most fertile person was around, and decide it was time to get hitched for life. You picked someone you thought would run a house well. To see if your hunch was true, you married them forever. And divorce being the slog that it was, separation meant that either you lived apart, unable to marry again because you'd already made your choice, or you died, which in Thorin's opinion seemed a fast way to guarantee unhappy spouses slipping arsenic into the available abundance of tea. Yet there was something appealing about the idea of no exit. Surely it precluded second-guessing, at least. Thorin had tried not to pursue that thought. Unfortunately, the thought was pursuing him. Thorin and Bilbo still had not discussed their initial fight. Thorin might have been fine with this, but unfortunately, not discussing a fight was not the same as no longer fighting. If Deas's rose with her husband had been siege warfare, then Bilbo and Thorin had settled into guerrilla tactics. They mentioned nothing and remembered everything. Every silence sounded like judgment. Every absence seemed like a rebuke. He had never imagined regretting being with Bilbo before. And he didn't regret it now, not really, not in the ways that it counted, which were questions like, do you love him? And do you want to spend the rest of your life with him? And was he worth more than Erebor? The answers to those questions were all yes, albeit yes said in very different tones of voice, and with very different amounts of pause in front of them that Thorin preferred to keep to himself. So, on that level, he knew he had made the right choice, which was the only choice that he could ever had made. And on another level, when the questions were things like, is your husband being an unreasonable ass at the moment? And is he demonstrating the full range of his passive aggression? And would it kill him to just put in a little effort here? Like, come on, you aren't asking much. Just say hi to the neighbors now and then. Endure a tea party. Stop locking yourself in the library, writing about the place you left for him, like he has more of a right to sulk than you about leaving your ancestral home. And by the way, what does it say that Bilbo seems to miss Erebor more than you do? And why are you pretending you don't miss Erebor? Because you do. Except you don't, except if you think about it so long, the hands of everyone you abandoned seem to wrap around your throat. But at least Bilbo isn't asking you anymore if you've written to your sister and friends yet. But you think that's because Bilbo knows you haven't and just doesn't care. But you can't ask him if he knows without knowing if he knows, because if he didn't know, then now he knows. And if he didn't know and now he knew, then he'd want to talk about it, which Thorin doesn't want to do and doesn't see why he should have to. And anyway, you wouldn't have to be thinking about any of this if he would just stop being so unreasonable. Mahal preserve me! None of that was the point. Thorin wouldn't linger on that. No lingering. When the letters from the mountain finally arrived, if they would ever arrive, Thorin would have to linger. But still no letters, which was causing a great deal of consternation among the hobbits in his life. He was used to that. Most things that benefited Thorin hurt his friends. He was still lingering, he noticed, and took another drink to stop himself. Anyway, all this information about Hobbit marriages, because he was pointedly not thinking about anything else, Thorin had learned over the last few weeks. Hobbit marriages was one of the first things it seemed you learned from hobbits, marriages being so central to the society that their conditions made up a good majority of the conversations. Though in truth, to call it what it really was, hobbits delighted in gossiping about the states of other people's marriages so much that Thorin rarely found himself introduced to someone without being later told by someone else about what that person's husband had done last winter, or how his drinking was driving his wife crazy, or how they said something was wrong with him medically. Not to speculate or anything so crass, but for a newlywed, she sure is shopping around. Or, worst of all, after a certain age, that the person he had been speaking to had not been married at all. This statement was usually accompanied by a meaningful look, if the singleton in question was a man, or a shudder of horror in the case of the women.
Your Mr. Baggins was a bachelor himself quite a while, wasn't he?
Someone would periodically add, and then there would be so many meaningful looks understood by every hobbit present that Thorin was often convinced the race was telepathic and only used words to humor him. That would at least explain Bilbo's recent silences. Thorin last Wednesday had been escorting Miss Pettibel. The women of Hobbiton always said that he was escorting them, as though they were not the only people who knew where they were going. when they ran into an acquaintance of hers, a Miss Maria Robin, who was considerably older than the average miss in the Shire, and suffered from the demographical misalignment of being very, very pretty by dwarven standards. Miss Pettibel had introduced them, and Miss Robin had curtsied and told Thorin that she was wondering when she'd meet the famous new tenant of Bag End. "Mind you," she had said, "there's been plenty of those recently." Then Miss Robin patted her hair, which was, in a word, abundant. "Have you, heard anything from, say, any of them?" "No," Thorin said, more curtly than he had intended. Miss Robin had wilted. "Oh, of course. I didn't mean to intrude. Not at all," she said sadly. The conversation consisted of a few more volleys of polite exchange before Miss Pettibel made their excuses. She and Thorin walked on, her arm looped through his and tugging him in the right direction when he got the mad idea that he could lead them. "It's tragic, you know. It really is," Miss Pettibel had said after a moment. "She was just wild about your Mr. Dwalin while he was here, when it was clear as day that the gentleman didn't think anything of her. But the dear had her heart set on him. She's far past her season. She'd take anyone kind to her. And poor Mr. Dwalin didn't know that she'd take politeness as encouragement. I don't wonder if he had to have stern words with her about his intentions." She glanced sideways at Thorin, as if he, perhaps, had wondered the same, and in pursuing that wonder had any concrete information to offer. Was all Thorin offered, his jaw still tight. Miss Pettibel sighed. "You don't want to be rude, but you do have to wonder why she thought that he might return her affections when Dwalin was so clearly sweet on your sister. I mean, I heard they were friends from your childhoods and that they'd always liked each other. But she had to marry some lord for the sake of politics. Them finding each other like this in the Shire, it's really a miracle if you think about it. It's just a shame that not everyone can recognize it as such. I was talking to Mr. Dwalin myself when he was waiting for you, and—" "Miss Pettibel," Thorin had said, stiff as rigor mortis, "I have no desire to discuss my family or my friends from Erebor." Her hand rose to her mouth. "Oh dear," she said. "Oh dear, of course. I can't imagine how painful it must be, just missing them. I told Lady Deas personally, I said, 'My dear Deas, you simply must stay a while longer. Think how hurt your brother will be when he arrives and you are gone. But oh, you dwarves and duty, I shan't ever understand it.'" That Thorin had missed his visitors, that he did not have to ever see them eye to eye, was in fact the miracle that had happened in the Shire. But Miss Pettibel's version sounded better in his ear. Thorin nodded. "Please," he said. I miss them so much. I cannot bear to hear about them." "I understand entirely," she replied earnestly. "What you have sacrificed to be here staggers me. Mr. Baggins must know that he is a very lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Thorin had said quietly, and Miss Pettibel had smiled the way you do upon hearing what you think a polite lie. "You're brooding, Mr. Oakenshield," Primula announced by way of greeting as she plopped down on the blanket beside Thorin, her skirt fanning around her. Thorin shook his head and came back to the world of the present, the world of the picnic and several dozen small children running, screaming around him, while the fathers drank and the mothers corralled. Primula had a daisy tucked behind her ear, a sweet tinge to her cheeks, and a mug of ale in her hand. Thorin, recognizing the easy contentment of the tipsy, smiled and raised his glass to her. She clinked her mug against it and said firmly,
"No brooding at the birthday party."
"I'm thinking."
"Thinking alone is brooding."
She looked around.
"Where's Bilbo? You should be thinking with him."
"We had a fight this morning,"
he didn't say.
"Again. Except it wasn't a fight because we don't know how to fight. Because we never used to fight except for the times we did fight. But usually those fights were things like, 'You shouldn't have come on this journey with us,' and 'You are suffering from gold sickness, please address that.' And for those kinds of fights, you could rely on some extraordinary circumstance to intervene to end it. A goblin attack usually did the trick. But there are no goblins around here ready to make things better. And maybe what living in the Shire means is that there aren't any extraordinary circumstances. There's just us in a house together, and we can't stop making each other mad. So we have petty arguments and say petty things and are petty people. And I know I should be better, but so should he. And I know it's the pettiness talking, but why should I have to be better first?"
"He's just finishing up some work," Thorin said. "He said he would come over separately when the chapter was done." Primula sighed.
"He works too hard. It's not right, a gentle hobbit like him. He'll make himself sick all over again."
She squinted at him.
"Has he told you about what we were working on, with his sickness and all, and getting better?"
"He mentioned it." Primula, thankfully, was too deep in her next swallow of ale to catch his tone.
"I think we've got something. Never you doubt it, Mr. Thorin. Medicine is just magic that we haven't thought about. Wait, no, the other way around. Medicine is just magic, which got her thinking."
She looked down.
"My cup is empty. Is your cup empty?"
Thorin drained his cup and handed it to her silently.
"Brilliant, yes. Very good. You're much nicer than your sister. Did you know that?"
Primula leaned forward, her hand half raised to cup her mouth.
"Don't tell her I said that."
"I won't tell her a word," Thorin said. And seeing Primula's face bearing the telltale signs of crumpling that Bilbo had warned him she was prone to when she remembered Diaz, he said urgently, "What about those drinks, then?"
"Right."
She nodded to herself.
"Right."
She hoisted herself to her feet with aplomb, her skirts poofing up around her. She spun around, seemingly just to make them do it again, and ran off to the refreshments table by way of directly through the children's football match. Thorin somewhat doubted he would ever see that cup again. This morning, for the record, the argument had been about gifts. Specifically, that Thorin was bringing one. "Drogo will give us gifts for his birthday," Bilbo had said, in that tone he had developed that instantly crawled under Thorin's skin. "You're not supposed to give him one." "I don't see anything wrong with generosity," Thorin had said back in the exact same tone, because he was annoyed and therefore Bilbo should be annoyed too. And yes, it was petty, but Bilbo had started it. Bilbo had rolled his eyes. "Oh, yes, of course, I'm the stingy, unreasonable one." "That's not what I said." "You didn't need to say the words." "I think I do need to say the words to receive censure for having said them. I don't see what's wrong with giving Drogo a gift." Bilbo had thrown up his hands. "Because it's not done, Thorin. That's not what we do."
Listen to yourself, Thorin had said. You sound like the hobbit that fainted in Bag End. I am that hobbit! You wanted to live in the Shire, Thorin! This is me, living in the Shire!
Thorin had finished wrapping his gift, a hand-carved model of a Shire lark with its wings expanded as if it would fly off at any moment. Thorin privately thought it his most beautiful carving yet. It practically trembled when you looked at it, as though it really would flee if you moved too fast. Even when he had been placing it in the box, Thorin found himself holding it as he would a real bird, his hands barely cupped around it. He'd felt a tremor of guilt as he closed the lid. It was a bird too wild for any cage. Any other day, Thorin might have told this to Bilbo. But today he was afraid that Bilbo might laugh at him for his pride. The worry made Thorin sick, and the sickness made Thorin angry.
I will risk my reputation to give a man I would like to know better a token of my appreciation for helping keep you alive, Thorin had snapped. If you wish to stand beside me and disown my actions as I do them, lest anyone suspect you of doing something that isn't done, then I welcome you to.
Bilbo had laughed humorlessly, his hands on his hips.
No, he said. No, please, give your gift. Everyone will love it. They'll be so charmed by you and your strange foreign ways. Maybe hobbits are simply less rigid than you accuse them of being.
Bilbo snorted.
Don't lecture me about my neighbors when you have known them for a month. They don't like you because you're an outsider. They like you because you're an outsider trying to be a hobbit. And that makes perfect sense to them, because who wouldn't want to be a hobbit? Me? I'm a hobbit trying to be an outsider. So forgive me if I see things differently.
Thorin had put a bow on his gift. Bilbo had gone back to his library. Thorin had left for the party. Bilbo had stayed. And 3 hours later, Bilbo had still not arrived.
If he doesn't come, I won't lie for him. Bilbo is an adult. He makes his own choices.
Thorin touched the little gift box he had tucked in his pocket and wished Primula would come back with his drink. He felt like drinking, which was probably a good sign that he shouldn't be. Which wasn't a very dwarven thought, now was it? Which would matter if Thorin was a proper dwarf. But Bilbo had said it himself. Thorin was no dwarf anymore. After all, what was a dwarf if not his people, his culture, his land? So Thorin wasn't a dwarf. Bilbo saw that so plainly he thought nothing of casually fobbing that line out. This was probably what Primula meant by brooding, wasn't it? Thorin stood with a groan and wondered how hobbits were possibly limber enough to sprawl on the ground as recreation. If Bilbo didn't want to come. But Thorin wanted Bilbo here. Thorin wanted him on the blanket beside him. Thorin wanted Bilbo leaning against his side and telling him stories about the parties this hill had seen, telling him about the people here and how they knew Bilbo before Thorin ever did, telling Thorin about all the little things that Bilbo thought Thorin would like to hear, which had always been everything, all of it, every word that Bilbo could offer. Thorin wanted to sit next to his husband without worry. That was all he had wanted in this land, and he didn't understand how that had become something he didn't expect. Then Bilbo didn't have to come. It didn't mean that Thorin needed to waste his energy worrying about it. Nothing to be gained from brooding. Drogo's cake was as tall as he was, and once his family hoisted it up onto the table, it towered over the crowd.
That's quite a confection,
Thorin told Drogo, who smiled embarrassedly.
I did argue for something a bit more modest, but Mum says she only gets to spoil her children so much now that we're grown, and she's miserable for weeks if we don't indulge her. She must love you very much. She certainly loves baking, Master Dwarf. Of that much I'm at least sure of.
Thorin glanced around discreetly, but at the moment he seemed to have the man of the hour to himself.
Drogo, about the gifts.
Oh, don't you worry,
Drogo quickly exclaimed.
Don't think you came too late to get something. I've been working on something for you all winter.
Thorin raised his hands and shook his head.
No, that's not what I... Wait, really?
Oh, of course,
Drogo said, as if there was never any possibility of anything else.
But you'll have to wait like everyone else. I'm not giving anything out until the cake is cut.
He looked around, scanning the crowd.
You think that will be enough time for Bilbo to get here? Primula said he was working.
A lifetime of politics and 5 years of kinging kept Thorin's face carefully neutral.
I'm sure he'll come whenever he feels he can.
Bilbo's warning had nearly put Thorin off his plan. Drogo's blithe assurance that Bilbo would show up put Thorin back on it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the little box.
I know you are to give the gifts, and we are to receive them,
Thorin said as Drogo's eyes widened.
But we do things differently in Erebor. I hope you won't be offended if I offer you my gift for your birthday.
Oh, Master Dwarf,
Drogo said, beaming bright as the sun as he wrapped his hands around the package.
Oh, I don't believe there's ever been a gift what offended a hobbit just for the giving. Bless you, sir. I didn't expect this in the slightest. Should I open it now?
If you like,
said Thorin, smiling to himself. He couldn't help it in the face of Drogo's open and obvious joy. Happiness of such an unabashed sort was a bit like an infectious disease.
Drogo, darling, what's that? You said we were holding off on the exchange until your cousin got here.
A woman came up to Drogo's side, glancing between Drogo and the dwarf looming over him. She had brown hair and brown eyes and a worried face that looked quite a bit like Drogo's, which in turn looked quite a bit like Bilbo's. In her quick glance towards Thorin, he got the impression that she had ascertained everything about him from age to shoe size, and although she had no immediate judgments to pass upon them, she was cataloguing that information for later.
Mum, this is the dwarf we've heard so much about,
Drogo said excitedly, resting his hand on his mother's arm and extending his reach towards Thorin like a magician making his grand reveal.
Thorin Oakenshield, this is...
Mrs. Baggins, thank you,
Mrs. Baggins, thank you, said.
You are the new occupant of Bag End?
One of them, yes,
Thorin said, bowing his head slightly.
You must be related to my husband.
Belladonna always assured us so.
Mrs. Baggins' eyes darted up and down once more.
Husband? Well, isn't that a surprise?
Mum?
Drogo warned. She silenced her son with a look.
I was saying nothing rude, Drogo. Don't use that tone against me. I was just remarking that I did not know what was more surprise, that our Bilbo married or that our Bilbo married.
She jerked her head towards Thorin.
Him!
Thorin supposed himself lucky that she hadn't referred to him as a that. He smiled politely, which is to say, coldly.
I was surprised myself that Bilbo would have me, a hobbit of such inestimable quality. But I did wait to propose to him until I was king. Perhaps that helped.
Mrs. Baggins looked like she wasn't sure if he was joking.
Mr. Oakenshield gave me a gift,
Drogo said rapidly. He thrust the little box in his mother's line of sight.
It's a custom back in Dwarfland, isn't that right, Thorin? When it's your birthday, you get the gifts. Isn't that strange? No offence intended, Mr. Oakenshield, but we do get far more presents our way, if that's the kind of thing you're interested in.
It was diplomacy by tidal wave. If nothing else, Drogo's ability to pack words in precluded anyone else from offering a sniping. Drogo shook the box a little, raising his eyebrow and grinning at Thorin.
It's a bottle of wine, isn't it?
He lifted the top of the box off and rewarded Thorin with a gasp.
Oh, dear,
said Drogo, as he lifted the Shirelark up with delicate fingers.
Would you look at that?
Even Mrs. Baggins was without words. Perhaps that meant she could not think of anything to critique.
Blimey.
Drogo ran his finger along the bill, open wide in silent song.
And here I just made you some socks.
That startled a laugh out of Thorin.
I didn't think you could make those around here.
We can make anything we need,
Mrs. Baggins said primly, but a little less so than before. She cast an appraising eye over Thorin's work and nodded to herself.
Your sister taught me,
Drogo said.
It's a shame she left when she did, for many reasons, of course, including the fact that you two just missed each other by, 5 weeks or so, which is hardly anything in the grand scheme of it all. But in this case, because she said she'd teach me how to make socks with toes. Can you imagine? She said she'd send me instructions by mail, but,
Drogo sighed.
Well, maybe we'll just learn on our own.
Thorin smiled tightly. Drogo looked around and leaned forward conspiratorially.
Mind you, I did try them on when I was done.
His mother gasped.
Oh, Drogo! You don't know where those socks have been!
I do know, Mum. I knitted them. And between the three of us, I have to say...
He glanced theatrically to make sure no one was listening, which was a quick way of getting other hobbits to pay attention to you.
They were very comfortable on my toes.
Mrs. Baggins' scandalized laugh brought over 3 other women Thorin didn't recognize, who were introduced to him in rapid succession, and whose names he would be expected to remember forever. Drogo showed them Thorin's carving, and they, too, gasped appreciatively.
You made that?
Asked one of them, and Thorin replied, yes.
And gave it to our Mr. Drogo?
Asked another one, and Thorin replied, yes again.
Is that a foreign thing?
Asked the third, and after a moment's thought, Thorin was forced to concede a yes to that one as well.
I say,
said the first, having snatched the bird from Drogo's hand to study it closer.
That's something new, isn't it?
Beautiful, said the second one.
You ought to be proud, Master Dwarf. Funny thing to be proud of, said the third. Seems like a waste of a perfectly good bird to me.
There was a short pause, and then Mrs. Baggins said,
"Oh, Guinea, he didn't dunk a lark in paint. He carved it himself. Oh, look at them feathers."
the third woman pointed.
"You think he could make those out of wood?" "Well, yes, I do think he could," said Mrs. Baggins. "One would think that was rather the point of the whole endeavour."
The third woman remained unconvinced. The bird was passed back to Drogo with sufficient praise, and then the three women left. A few moments later, Thorin heard the distinct phrase, "bird murderer," floating back to him on the wind.
That's Genevieve grub for you. Bless her,
Drogo said. If there was any irony in that last statement, it was so well hidden that Thorin doubted even Drogo was aware of it.
She tried to set Bilbo on fire once, you know. What?
"Oh, don't be spreading viciousness, Drogo," Mrs. Baggins said. "We were all thinking of lighting up a pyre that day."
What?
Drogo patted Thorin on the arm.
Bilbo's funeral. It's a funny story, really. Depending on your perspective.
Thorin was still processing that when Drogo looked past his shoulder and beamed.
But hey, you can hear about it from the horse's mouth himself. Though, maybe on reflection, just thinking about it, the horse might know the least about what was going on at the races, you know.
Thorin thought for a moment.
No?
"He's saying your Bilbo has finally shown up, and not a moment too soon."
As she turned to cut the cake, Mrs. Baggins muttered,
"Several moments too late, I'd say."
And the picnic went silent. No, not silent exactly. The children kept screaming. The birds kept tweeting. The band kept warming up. All that continued. But there was a strange lull, as if Thorin's head had ducked under water. It was a group pause, the same that had followed Thorin on his first day at market, when Bilbo escorted him. And now, standing at one end of the picnic as Bilbo arrived on the other, it occurred to Thorin for the first time that perhaps it had not been the dwarf the hobbits had been gawping at that day. Bilbo walked through the crowd with a bag slung over his shoulder and his head held high. The people in front of him ignored him until he passed by. Then they turned to stare. They nudged each other and whispered, their eyes tracing Bilbo when he could not see. A few nodded greetings. Most sized him up or cut him dead. And Thorin could not help but think back to the Whitfoot tea room where he had met Primula on Tuesday morning, before the evening turned disastrous. He thought of the hobbits he had seen there, in such disreputable styles as pigtails, doing such wild activities as sitting alone. He thought about how, except for Primula, none of them were here at the picnic today. And he had seen none of them in the parlors of the hobbits who opened their homes to him. And when he saw them on the street while arm in arm with some proper young lady or fine young gent, he was never introduced to them. The proper and fine hobbits of the Shire led Thorin neatly past their village rebels, and Thorin had thought nothing of it. He was from cities, his own and the ones he wandered through in exile. He never expected to be introduced to everybody on the street. And because he hadn't expected that, it hadn't occurred to him to notice in particular what introductions he never got. So far, he'd just been thinking about how grateful he was for the ones he got.
"Just like Bilbo Baggins to make a scene,"
said one of the women, who not moments ago had been so graciously admiring Thorin's handiwork.
Just like his mother, isn't he?
She wasn't speaking to him. Thorin didn't care. He turned around and said,
"He's just walking."
The woman looked at him, stunned.
"You have a very low standard for scenes if you think he's causing one."
"Master Dwarf, this is a private conversation,"
replied the woman. Thorin cocked his head.
"Then why are you having it in public?"
"Mr. Oakenshield,"
said Mrs. Baggins sternly, and all the sterner for still having her knife in hand.
"Manners."
"I am not the rude one here," Thorin said. "Or is it custom in the Shire to allow guests at your gathering to insult their fellows unchallenged?"
She put a slice of cake on a plate and held it out to him. Thorin had to hand it to her. That was a very elegant way of offering to glue his mouth shut. He shook his head and turned away from both women. His heart pounded.
"And what if I did not wish to live my life trapped?"
Bilbo had said.
"Poor breeding,"
someone muttered, low enough that they could pretend that it wasn't meant for Thorin to hear.
"You can see why he married Mad Baggins."
"Ignore them,"
Drogo said lowly.
"It's the only way to live around here. You ignore them or you are them. And I know which one is worse."
He patted Thorin on the arm. Then he held his hand to his mouth and shouted,
"Oi! Mr. Bilbo! Over here!"
Drogo waved Bilbo over and nudged Thorin.
"Look at that bag he's got."
He gave Thorin a grin, no less enthusiastic for being slightly embarrassed.
"Would you judge me if I hoped he was bringing a gift too?"
"I wouldn't count on it,"
Thorin almost said, but he bit it back.
"Maybe he is,"
he said instead, watching Bilbo stroll through a field of stairs as if they were so many daisies. When Bilbo's eyes found him, Thorin smiled. He couldn't help it. It was always what he wanted to do when he looked at his husband. Bilbo didn't smile back. Instead, he twisted the bag on his shoulder so that he could reach inside it as he walked. Thorin's smile wavered, and then it froze. Horror is sometimes the lightning to bad news's thunder. They're the same thing, but one comes first. Before Thorin knew what Bilbo had, he knew what Bilbo had. What Bilbo pulled out of the bag were letters. There was a crossroads out east a ways that was notable for nothing except being a location where at one point multiple road designers had inadvertently crossed their paths. When you walked one way, you ended up in Bree. When you walked the other way, you ended up everywhere. It was not an important road to the wide world. It was not even an important road to most hobbits, who tended to especially appreciate the things the wide world didn't. It was really only important to a very, very small subset of the Shire's population. People who knew people elsewhere. Because this tiny, minor, not particularly important crossroads was the hub through which every mail truck headed towards the Shire. As it happened, the winter snowmelt and the spring rains had done something awful to the road.
"The river flooded out there. It's been nearly impossible to get through. That's what the postman said, at least,"
Bilbo was saying as Drogo and Primula sorted through the envelopes he had come bearing in his arms. A few other hobbits were hanging around on the periphery, always interested in whatever new thing was going on. But most were occupied with little Philip Brownfoot's band, which was just kicking off the dancing. Gossip, as delicious as hobbits found it, could wait. Dancing never did.
I was heading out to come to the picnic when the postman came, lugging a particularly battered box of mail. I'm afraid I got caught up reading a few and rather lost track of time. Apparently outgoing mail travels along a different route because they get picked up by dwarven traders heading where we need them to go, and dwarves will ford anything, anytime to get where they need to be. But the return mail is the trickier bit. No traders ever come our way, so any replies to us come along the Porterfield route, which means they've been getting bogged down in a horrendous swampland for the last few months. It's supposed to be abysmal going.
Primula said, sifting through her letters with gleeful giddiness.
More like the carts didn't want to risk the mud for our sake and just tossed off the letters for someone else to deal with.
We're very new customers to the business of international postage,
Drogo said cheerfully, forgiving every negligent postman in the world with a breezy smile.
We can't be a profitable venture.
The world isn't about profits,
Primula said, with all the assurance of a woman who had grown up rich.
There's plain decency as well. Oh, Drogo, look!
She'd ripped open a letter addressed to her, sealed, not that Primula would recognize it, with the royal crest of the line of Durin. She held out the paper.
My dear Primula, we are astonishingly alive, despite the misery of winter travel. Right there, written on the page. She did write.
Drogo held out a few more envelopes, all with Dias's neat hand and all addressed to Primula. She scooped them all up with an exuberant whoop.
I'm counting these as your gift for me,
she told Drogo,
because this is the greatest thing you could have passed over to me.
Drogo, who had spent a great many hours over the last few months crocheting a new shawl for her, looked like he was trying to figure out how he felt about this exclamation, when Primula flung her arms around him and planted a kiss on his cheek. Drogo promptly turned the color of a cherry tomato. Primula bounced back and grinned.
I'm reading these right now,
she announced, her cheeks a little red themselves, and scampered away towards the dancing. Drogo straightened a cravat that in no way was ruffled and said,
well, ain't that just, well...
He coughed again, placed his hands on his hips, and regarded his party like a man who knew that the day had just reached its pinnacle.
Good for the mail, he said brightly. Mr. Thorin, did you get anything?
It was an innocent question. It was an obvious question. It was a question that should have had an innocent, obvious answer. Yes, Thorin should have said, and shown Drogo the letters that he had received from his sister in Erin Luwine, from his nephews and friends in Erebor. But Thorin could not say that, and could not do that. Thorin had no letters addressed to him. No one knew that he was here to address them to. And Bilbo knew. Bilbo had not known that Thorin hadn't written anyone before, but Bilbo knew now. Bilbo did not look at Thorin when he lied numbly.
Yes, I'll read them at home.
Drogo nodded happily, evidently satisfied. He turned his bundle of letters over in his hands.
You've arrived in quite the dwarven fashion, haven't you? Bearing gifts. Thorin aims to make it the new fashion in the Shire, doesn't he?
Bilbo said, still without a glance Thorin's way.
I'll admit I fussed at him about it this morning.
Revisionist history, if ever Thorin heard it. Any moment now, Bilbo would say something about hypocrites who espoused the need to maintain new relationships while ruthlessly ignoring the old. And Thorin would ask something like, wasn't Bilbo tired of these passive-aggressive jabs? To which Bilbo would reply something about this wasn't passive aggression, this was civility. And Thorin would laugh bitterly and ask what Bilbo knew about civility, when for the last 5 days he'd been sulking in his library because Thorin asked him to maybe say hi to other people. And Bilbo would get that cold, cold look in his eyes, because they both knew that wasn't what this was about. And Thorin would wonder why he said anything at all, why he couldn't say anything right, why he couldn't reach out right now and say that he understood now why Bilbo could find the Shire inhospitable. But Thorin wouldn't say any of it. And Bilbo wouldn't say anything either, and it would be one more spat, just a series of barbs jabbed in each other's soft spots, and they'd wait to see if they had learned how to fight yet. But Bilbo said nothing of the sort. Instead, he shrugged and smiled and said,
I was being ridiculous, of course. Oh, I'll say,
Drogo exclaimed as Thorin faltered. Drogo pulled out the little carving from his breast pocket as if it were a real bird, cupped as carefully in his hands as if it would fly away at any moment. Too tight a grip would crush it forever. Too loose a grip, and it would still be gone. Drogo's care said more to Thorin than 1,000 compliments on his craftsmanship.
I mean, who could fuss about a thing like this?
Drogo held the bird out to Bilbo, who opened his mouth before he looked at it. Then Bilbo looked at it, and his mouth shut. And for the first time, Bilbo truly saw it. Thorin had worked on it for the last 2 weeks, whittling and thinking, and not thinking and whittling. And Bilbo, especially after their fight, didn't cast Thorin's work a second look. Were this some other week, Thorin would have shown him. But if Bilbo wasn't going to look, then Thorin wasn't going to make him. And then Bilbo kept not looking, and Thorin kept not making him. And it got to the point that every moment that Bilbo wasn't looking was a direct snub. That was the way the last few days had festered, obviously irrational and no less bitter for it. If they had been sharing the same bed at night, Thorin no doubt would have lain awake while Bilbo slept, fuming at how Bilbo was currently ignoring him. Bilbo wasn't ignoring him now. He was looking at Thorin's work with a strange softness in his eyes. He almost, but not quite, brushed his fingers against the Shirelark's wings before he curled his hand back.
"Oh, it is a work of wonder,"
Bilbo murmured.
"I've always loved these birds." "Just like your mother before you,"
Drogo said. Bilbo looked up at him, confused, but then the expression parted like clouds, and he said,
"Yes, they were. I'd quite forgotten. I remember her telling me about them at one family reunion," Drogo said. "Your dad was off with his siblings, and your mum was trying to escape the whole thing. You were there too, I imagine, with your father, I think. I was out in the garden sulking about something. You know, being a little one and all that, with no shortage of things to sulk about, surrounded by all those adults, talking about people I'd never met and didn't care about.
He laughed.
It was fresh spring then, and I stumbled across your mum on her walk, and she must have taken pity on me, or else she was just bored by herself. But she took me with her through the fields behind our grand's house, and talked to me the way she always talked to us kids when no one else was around.
And which way was that? Bilbo asked.
Well, you know how sometimes she'd start saying a sentence that you just knew was going to end someplace so interesting that you couldn't even guess what it would be. And then one aunt or another would say something like, "Belladonna, really?" When no one else was around, your mum got to finish her sentences. And she said to me, well, a lot of things that day. But I remember the larks were singing for the first time in the year. And she said to me, "Do you know about them?
The larks are the first to leave for the winter and the last to return. That's why we don't say that spring has sprung until we hear the larks. That means everyone has come home. And they bring gifts back. Wherever they go, they learn songs they then carry with them."
"Listen," she said. And then, as we listened, a lark began to sing.
Drogo closed his eyes, frowned in thought, and whistled a short melody. He shrugged awkwardly.
It was something like that, anyway. Your mother would have known.
She would have, Bilbo said. She memorized the lark songs every year. She liked to hum them all through the year until the larks came back in the spring again and brought her new songs from far away. His voice was old cloth, worn soft at the edges. She said it was her reminder that there was a whole world out there, and that the Shire was a part of it, no matter how much we pretend that we can ignore it and be ignored. Drogo smiled broadly.
Aye, that's what she told me.
It was my father's favourite bird as well, because it always came home again.
Aye, your mother told me that as well.
Drogo glanced at Thorin, who quickly conspired to find the trees to his left very interesting.
This bird is mine now?"
he asked, and without waiting for an answer,
"Oh, yes, it is. Thorin gave it to me for my birthday."
Then he pressed the carving into Bilbo's hands.
"So, since it is mine, now this is my birthday gift to you."
Bilbo started, but his hands closed reflexively around the little bird.
"Oh, I can't accept this. Oh, that's not how birthdays work around here, Mr. Buggins," Drogo said cheerfully. "You'll offend me horribly if you don't accept my gift. I might go around telling everyone that Bilbo Buggins is an ungrateful so-and-so."
Bilbo smiled wryly. "Blackmail me with the truth, will you?" Drogo laughed and said, a little louder,
"Now, I really hope I won't be offending you, Mr. Thorin, but you did say that it was mine to do with as I please, and I imagine a craftsman like yourself understands that the most pleasing thing you can do is give someone you care about something you think they'll like. That's the whole point of birthdays, isn't it?"
"Are we doing gifts, Drogo?"
someone called from back around the cake.
"I saw you giving something to the other Mr. Buggins. Does that mean it's time for gifts?" Come down, you greedy bastard!"
Primula shouted from the blanket she sprawled on, her head resting in another woman's lap, letters open all around her. Thorin's cup, he noticed, was tossed down about her feet.
Yes, it's time for gifts,"
Drogo shouted back, his voice heavy with laughter.
"Form a line over by Mum. I'll be getting my things."
Drogo turned back to Bilbo with a helpless shrug. and Bilbo said,
Go, go, your mob awaits.
He brought the bird close against his chest. He, too, held it like a living thing.
And thank you.
Drogo tipped his hat to his cousin, and then to Thorin, who returned the gesture with a smile that hopefully, but not realistically, contained none of his nerves. Then Drogo left, and what remained were two people standing close enough that they ought to acknowledge each other, but far enough away that they were clearly not together. Thorin could not remember the last time he hadn't clearly been Bilbo's. Bilbo was watching the bird in his hands, as if it would take off. He wore his thinking face, the one Thorin had seen 1,000 times over the last 5 years, usually in response to some problem that wasn't even Bilbo's. It was the face of Bilbo thinking on behalf of Thorin. After a moment, Bilbo reached up and tugged the knot out of his cravat. He wrapped the bird in silk, tucked the bird in his pocket, and took 3 steps forward. It closed the distance between them enough to transform them from strangers into a couple. Bilbo stepped close enough to Thorin to hold his hand. Thorin raised his chin. When Bilbo stood too closely and Thorin stood too proudly, it was easy to avoid eye contact. He waited for the scolding. He braced for the fight.
Have you seen Dragon Creek yet?
Bilbo asked instead. Thorin, who was ready for a great many things that Bilbo might spit at him, mostly because Thorin had already spat them all at himself, having spent the last few hours fighting fights that hadn't happened yet, had no counterattack prepared for this. Quickly he tried to improvise and came up with,
No.
Bilbo jerked his head towards the east, on the other side of the swell of land.
Come on, I'll show you.
And misunderstanding the look on Thorin's face, or perhaps just choosing to, he said,
Don't worry, it's just a few minutes' walk. We'll be back in time for Drogo to bequest upon you his socks. But it's a bit more private a place to talk.
Bilbo reached out and tangled his fingers in Thorin's. Thorin froze.
Don't tell him I told you that you're getting socks. Do not worry,
said Thorin, shock like some strange bird beating frantic wings in his chest. Bilbo's hand was clammy from sweat. He was nervous, too, and strangely that calmed Thorin. He felt less alone.
He already told me. Of course he did,
Bilbo said, not as lightly as he was clearly trying to sound, but not at all the strained politeness that he'd been offering before.
He's very proud of them, you know. You'll have to tell him how much you like them. I think they're the first socks ever constructed in the Shire. At least legitimately. But who knows, there are weirdos hiding everywhere. I'm sure they'll be wonderful, Thorin said. Maybe I will start a new trend in the Shire. Maybe.
Bilbo seemed to be seriously considering the possibility.
Foreign seeds are always a difficult plant around here, but it has been done.
Dragon Creek was just a short walk east of the party, and they made the walk in silence. Bilbo walked a little ahead and tugged Thorin along. Thorin allowed himself to be tugged along. It was almost easy between them right now. Almost easy words, almost easy touch, almost easy looks, almost easy breaths. Dragon Creek, in turn, was almost a creek. Dragon Trickle would have been a fairer name. Thorin could block it up with a few rocks.
Then don't put down any rocks,
Bilbo replied. He left Thorin on one bank with one hand still tingling from his grasp, and, with one moderate step, crossed over to the other. He patted a stone primarily notable for being the only one around, and announced,
"The titular dragon."
The rock came up to Bilbo's chest and had 2 indentations that he explained were the eyes. Underneath them was a protrusion that was the snout, and underneath that was the crack that, obviously, had to be the mouth. The stones on the bank were the dragon's scales, which Thorin thought was a clever touch.
"So you see,"
Bilbo said, patting the rock's hump as he would the nose of a pony,
"we do have a dragon."
Not at all sure what he was supposed to say to this non sequitur, Thorin offered,
"It's very frightening." "Oh, yes, it is. All the children know that it comes to life during thunderstorms. That's when you can hear its teeth gnashing. Your hometown still has a friendlier relationship with your neighborhood dragon than mine."
Bilbo shrugged a little sheepishly.
"Well, we've never had any of them. No risk, no chance of seeing one in person. There are a great many hobbits in the Shire who didn't know dragons were real before our friends went traipsing through town talking about them. And a good many still think we're lying."
Bilbo patted the snout again with such obvious affection that Thorin felt momentarily jealous.
"I played out here often when I was young. I was an only child, a true oddity in the Shire, I assure you. And I wasn't very good at making friends."
He paused.
"I'm still not, now I think of it. But I didn't mind. I liked going on adventures just like my mother. Or imagining them, at least. I think that I slayed this rock 12 times."
The image of a young Bilbo, high as Thorin's knees, with a gap-toothed grin and a homemade sword, was the sort of thought that made Thorin understand a little why some people chose to have children. It was a sort of way to see the person you loved growing up when you hadn't been around to see the actual thing. Thorin could have given just about anything in that moment to see Bilbo the Wild Child, terror of the Shire dragons.
"Gandalf never told me you had that much experience. You truly were uniquely qualified."
Bilbo laughed, easy as the creek flowed. And of course, once he'd conceived that comparison, Thorin was struck remembering how easily the creek could be dammed forever. As far as similes went, that one did make a body compelled to tread carefully.
"All the experience, perhaps, but no qualifications," Bilbo said. "Just look, the dragon still stands."
He shrugged a shoulder, a strange wistfulness in his eyes.
"It stood for my mother and my father, and their mothers and their fathers, and so on and so forth, until we go back in time enough to see when the damn rock ended up here in the first place, and someone got around to naming it. It's not mine to properly slay. The next generation deserve their whack at it."
They stood by the creek, the light of the early afternoon sliced into ribbons by the leaves above them, the water tumbling between them. In the not-so-distant distance, the party babbled, laughed, cheered, danced, sang. Bilbo tilted his head back and closed his eyes. The sunlight dappled him. He looked like a statue. No, he looked like a muse. Thorin's fingers itched for a knife and a good piece of wood. "I have to say something," Bilbo said. Thorin's mouth was dry. "Then say it." "I don't want to say it." "You must." Bilbo smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, but it wasn't an unfriendly one. It was a step above a grimace, at least, and several steps above a scowl. "No, I rather don't, now that I think about it. I was going to yell at you. You know about what?" Thorin did not flinch, but only because he'd been bracing himself. "The letters." "I got letters from both Erebor and Eowyn today. Both mountains seemed surprised to hear from me that you were in the Shire. You haven't written them, have you?" Thorin took a deep breath. "No, I haven't." Bilbo nodded, as if confirming. "Well," he said, as if that was it, as if that was all that he needed to say. Thorin steeled himself and began confession. "I know I should have. I know I lied to you. I know I hurt them. That I am currently hurting them." Bilbo waved that off. "Oh, it's not so dire as that. You do have the built-in excuse of distance, and our mail is atrocious. We can always pretend your letters got lost, if you like." Thorin stared at him, trying to process what Bilbo had said. "I have been letting my friends and family continue to believe that I am missing, when I am in fact alive," he said slowly, in case Bilbo had just not understood. "I sent my raven away so that you would not suspect." "Oh, good heavens, really? That's hardly kind to your raven." "I have abandoned the people who love me," Thorin exclaimed. "Are you trying to start a fight?" Bilbo asked, an edge of warning to his voice. "I would have thought you were as tired of that as I am." Thorin did not know how to end that sentence. He was exhausted of fighting. He deserved to be fought. He knew without needing to say it aloud that Bilbo would disagree with the second sentiment. Then Bilbo held up a palm and took the decision of whether to talk from Thorin by requesting his silence. Thorin was happy to oblige. Bilbo bit his lip and scrunched his nose up. He looked like a rabbit in emotional distress. Thorin couldn't help but smile. Bilbo caught sight of it and huffed a little. "Thorin," he said, and then paused so long in thought that Thorin felt compelled to make a little go-on gesture with his hands. Bilbo sighed and started again. "You were unhappy in Erebor," he said at last, "and I didn't notice. I didn't notice it as anything in particular. I was too wrapped up in my own adventure. I was too tricked by your deflections. Then you left and brought me here. And I know you did it to save my life, but I know you also did it for other reasons. To save your own. So all through the winter, as I waited to see if you were alive or dead or just gone, I thought about you.
and how poorly I had seen you. And I promised myself that I would never be so oblivious to you again. And then you came here, and I was so blissfully happy and so blissfully ignorant once more. I promised myself, which means I hadn't promised you, which means I was the only person who was to hold myself accountable. And I was too.
Bilbo bit the words off. He rested his hand on the dragon's skull. His fingers flexed and splayed. My mother travelled. Did I ever tell you about that?
Not very much,
Thorin said, momentarily thrown by the shift. Before they'd come to the Shire, Bilbo had mentioned his mother very little. He invoked the Tooks far more often than the woman who connected him to them. You should have tried to reclaim Erebor a decade earlier. You could have met her, and I would have been younger and more dashing and better fit for all the damn walking we did.
You were plenty dashing,
Bilbo finished with a smile.
I knew you were going to say that, you flatterer.
Relieved for a moment in the conversation where he felt he could just breathe, Thorin smiled and shrugged. The breather didn't last. Bilbo shook his head.
My mother travelled, he said, and then she stopped. Dad asked her to stop. He couldn't bear her wandering and him not knowing if she was alive or dead or just gone. They fought about it when I was young, very young. I didn't hear all their arguments, but I heard enough. Then one day I didn't hear any more, and Mum didn't travel ever again. Not outside the Shire. She restricted her explorations to within its borders, and always within a day of home. I thought Dad won. Those were the two options, weren't they? He wins or she wins. She stays or she goes. People used to say that my mother finally settled. I always wondered which way they meant that. So I swore to myself that I wouldn't be the kind of person who had adventures and then just stopped. The kind of person who lived for a few short years and then spent the rest of their life living on whatever stories they had collected when they had been wild.
Bilbo shrugged.
Then I became a very respectable adult, and never had any adventures ever. It was hardly true to the spirit of my vow, but I suppose it fulfilled the letter. Then you met me? Asked Thorin. Then I met Gandalf, you egotist. Bilbo wrung his hands. And he was right, damn it. An adventure was good for me. And then I lived in Erebor, and the adventure never really ended. I thought...
Bilbo laughed bitterly.
I thought I might even keep travelling at some point. You were always so busy, it didn't seem like I would be abandoning you at home so much as keeping myself occupied. But there was always so much to do, and I was so tired, and I kept thinking, well, no rush. I can go off exploring when I feel better.
Bilbo laughed sadly, his eyes downcast.
I always thought I would die in the Shire. I just never wanted to come back and live in it.
Bilbo,
Thorin said, stepping forward. The creek was such a minor thing that Thorin could ford it in a step. He took Bilbo's hands and stopped them from choking each other by holding them in his own.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't apologize to me. It's not your fault I'm trapped here. And I love the Shire with all my heart. I do. I truly do. When I was away, I missed it so much I could hardly breathe for homesickness. It's just...
He laughed again, every bit as sadly as before.
I think I would love it better if I could leave it whenever I want.
Bilbo shook his head, his eyes wet, but his mouth set.
But it doesn't matter. I should be the one apologizing to you. You don't have to,
Thorin said softly.
Not at all. But I will,
Bilbo said, with a mulish lift to his chin.
And I do. Thorin, I thought so hard about what I wanted, and I assumed that I knew what you wanted. I fretted so long on ills I suffered, and ignored everyone else's. I knew what I thought I didn't want, and that was all that mattered.
He sighed again. Thorin brought his hands to his lips.
I never had siblings before you. My family network was one of polite obligation from people who knew my parents and felt they must know me as well. In truth, before Gandalf bothered me across the world, I did not even have any friends to speak of. I had acquaintances I dodged and my books. Now that I have an abundance of people with whom to share my life, I am still unlearning my selfishness. It is not selfishness, Thorin protested. You are selective with your time and company, not mean. Sweet but untrue, dear. I hoard everything. My time, my company, my problems, my joys. I assume you know I love you only because I know I love you, and therefore I see no reason to act to show you. I know you love me. Only because I just told you now. Because of this week, I know you love me, Thorin said wryly. Because I know you, and I know you would not let me into your life as you do if you didn't love me.
Bilbo didn't look amused.
That's not good enough. I shouldn't simply get points for effort.
Thorin raised an eyebrow.
Why not? Because...
Bilbo threw up his hands. He had to wrench them free from Thorin's first.
Because I am trying to apologize, and I'm still getting myself all wrapped up in myself. What are you apologizing for? Thorin asked. For being a blind, selfish idiot. I would never accept an apology from a man who talked about my beloved husband in such a way. I'm not the husband you ought to have. You're the only husband I ever wanted. That's because...
Bilbo cut himself off.
You were about to say that's because you have bad taste, weren't you? I admit nothing.
Thorin grinned.
You're getting much better at apologizing, swallowing your insults and everything.
Bilbo sighed.
I should hope I'm improving, considering the state I've been in. I can't believe I got angry at you this morning for wanting to bring a gift. To be fair,
Thorin said solemnly.
I know how much you care about your respectability.
Bilbo huffed, and Thorin laughed, encircled his husband in his arms. After a moment, Bilbo relaxed, sighing once more as his weight settled against Thorin. His hands rose and hooked themselves in Thorin's braces. They breathed together a while, Thorin resting his chin on the top of Bilbo's head.
Dears needs to know that you're alive,
Bilbo said.
She can tell everyone else.
Thorin closed his eyes. He nestled his cheek into Bilbo's hair.
I don't know what to say.
It was easier to say while holding him.
You can start with just the facts. That you're here. You're well. You're quite popular with all the widows in the neighborhood. We'll work from there.
Bilbo pulled back and met Thorin's eye. Thorin looked away.
I can write it, if you like.
Thorin shook his head before he could process the temptation.
It's mine to do. She's my sister, my family, my friends. I have to do it.
Are you sure? Asked Bilbo carefully.
Because the thing about marriage, as I understand it, is that your family becomes my family, and vice versa. I'm sure that's somewhere in that massive contract you had drafted. So I rather think it's our family, our friends, our sister.
He squeezed Thorin's hands.
Our letter. I'll write it, you read it, and we'll sign it together. Isn't that what the disgustingly domestic couples do?
Thorin closed his eyes again and swallowed around the lump in his throat.
Or we could go back,
he offered so quietly he couldn't be sure if the words existed as more than thought. But then Bilbo stiffened, and Thorin was sure. Bilbo stayed silent so long that Thorin had to look. His husband watched him with eyes like feather down, soft and fluttering. He wasn't crying, but it looked like he had considered it.
Thank you,
Bilbo said, with such a gentle smile that Thorin grew fearful for it in such a harsh world.
But no, we couldn't, love. You said yourself, it's a death sentence. And you said yourself that you were fine for years,
Thorin pressed. Bilbo raised his eyebrow.
And you said yourself that all that meant was that I would eventually get sick again. And you said yourself that you and Primula had theories about that. Theories that we hadn't tested and nothing has come of.
The thought of returning to Erebor felt like gold did. It made Thorin so sick with want and fear that he knew he was better off avoiding it altogether, for the good of everyone. But prudence and cowardice were always so hard for Thorin to tell apart.
Still nothing, Thorin. We'd spend our time getting to Erebor, and then we'd just have to turn around. You were right. That's no way to live. If you wanted to try, I won't cast you into another exile, Thorin,
Bilbo said. I won't." In answer, Thorin leaned down and kissed his husband. He'd read love poetry and its bawdier cousin. He knew what poets said of kissing. Nonsense about stars colliding and heat pooling and the promise of something more. The first time that Thorin and Bilbo kissed, they had agreed there was none of that. It wasn't like being struck by lightning. It wasn't like blood turning to fire. It was nothing like pain. Kissing Bilbo was like holding his hand, just for the pleasure of feeling his hand, because the skin of the person you love is the softest you will ever touch. It was like sleeping in the same bed and memorizing the pattern of his snores against your neck. It was like a promise. Yes, just like the poets said. A promise of something more. A promise of tomorrow. A promise you would see the other again in the morning, and you would have another day to live. Thorin loved Bilbo's body as Thorin loved Bilbo, because Thorin loved the eloquence of flesh. Bilbo was the writer. Thorin got his meaning across in the stroke of his fingers across Bilbo's cheek.
"I love you,"
he meant.
"I know you love me. We are going to be fine."
Touch was a two-way street. As Thorin kissed that last sentiment against Bilbo's skin, Bilbo convinced Thorin of its truth. Life had changed. They were different people in different places, and they were going to be fine, one way or another.
And the picnic is ending,
Thorin said. Bilbo, dozing on the blanket beside Thorin, sighed and rolled over until he half curled around Thorin's leg. One hand came down to rest on the top of Thorin's brand new socks. They were very purple.
We should leave, then,
he mumbled reluctantly,
before they ask us to help clean up.
Thorin tousled Bilbo's hair and left his hands in the curls.
You horrible grouch. But you're absolutely right. I think Drogo's mother is impressing volunteers. It'd be a good way to get in her good graces, I suppose,
Bilbo said, without making any effort to move.
She knows a great many reputable hobbits we'd have to invite over to tea. I'm not interested in that,
Thorin said firmly. Bilbo raised an eyebrow.
No? I'm planning to start cultivating some relationships with the disreputable hobbits. The reputable ones are, well...
Thorin cast about for the right word.
Judgmental.
Bilbo grinned. He didn't say, "I told you so," but mostly because the grin said it well enough.
A good time to retreat, then,
he replied, and kept lying down. Thorin nudged him. Bilbo flopped the other way. Thorin scratched Bilbo under the chin, ignoring his husband's groan of disapproval.
"Oh, I'm getting up. Just give me a moment."
This was why it had taken so long to tell that Bilbo had been sick. The hobbit just loved sleeping.
You had your moment. Come on, you grab the blanket and I'll lead the way,
Thorin said. Without opening his eyes, Bilbo replied,
Why don't you grab the blanket and I'll lead the way? Drogo told me you got lost on the way to the field, which is an impressive feat considering that there is only the one field in the area with a gathering of 100 hobbits. Your road system was poorly engineered.
Bilbo stretched and yawned. It was such a feline gesture that Thorin only just stopped himself from rubbing Bilbo's stomach.
To be fair to Hobbit engineering, they are just goat roads we made official. True, goats are very bad at grid layouts, but they're very good at finding the most convenient paths between, say, a pond for drinking water and a nice tree to sit underneath. You'll get used to them. To live with hobbits, you must think like a goat. Something like that.
Thorin leaned down over his husband, who cracked an eye open at him when Thorin's shadow cut across his face.
Come on, I'll bet I've found a few shortcuts back to Bag End that will add at least a couple hours to the journey by the time I'm done mangling them. Let's take the long way home. We'll see if we can't find anything surprising and new along the way.
This close to Bag End? Bilbo weighed the odds.
It's a long shot. I specialize in long shots. You specialize in mad plans, you mean? Isn't that what I said?
Bilbo laughed and held out his hand. Thorin pulled him up.
All right, then. Lead on, brave captain. Just don't be disappointed when I tell you I've seen it all before. But you've never seen it with me,
Thorin pointed out. Bilbo almost said something, and then he paused, his head cocked.
Very true, said Bilbo. And perhaps it is the company that matters, far more than the place itself. After all, getting lost on a long walk with you has led to the best parts of my life. I never got us lost,
Thorin said, his chest warm as a hearth fire and his heart fluttering like a bird. Which, taking a moment to think about it, was not a very good situation for the bird were this simile to be made literally. But maybe it was concerns like this that made Bilbo the poet of their relationship.
I got us to Erebor precisely on time.
Bilbo scooped up the blanket and tossed it over his shoulder.
Those are two different things, and Mrs. Baggins is looking at us.
Oh, boys!
Drogo's mother called.
Come lend a hand with the tables.
We're far enough away that we can pretend we didn't hear her,
Thorin said.
Oh, I love you,
Bilbo said. It would be wrong to say that they ran. Hobbits, after all, did not run, and Thorin was getting much better at being a hobbit. Bilbo was, too, when he felt like it. But they did amble at a glorious pace, Thorin's long legs ambling just a little faster as he tugged Bilbo along by the hand. And Bilbo behind him, laughing, and the sunlight above them streaming, and Thorin a little bit away, watching himself and his husband rapidly meander home by way of the opposite direction there, a route that would take them down by the market, and out through the fields, and across over a stream, and up past the meadows, which are fields with their hair let down. And Thorin would, in fact, pluck a daisy to stick behind his husband's ear. He had never realized a dream so quickly after conceiving it. It helped that his dreams were smaller these days. They were, in fact, Hobbit-sized. They slept together in the same bedroom that night. They wouldn't always. Thorin knew that. Thorin snored and Bilbo kicked, all while waging a never-ending war of attrition for bed space. Bilbo normally went to bed only a few hours before Thorin normally woke up. Thorin had nightmares best experienced alone. Nightmares that came whether or not he slept beside Bilbo. And always he worried about flailing out in his sleep, striking out against the body that tried to comfort him. Bilbo had nightmares of his own, and Bilbo preferred to keep his nightmares private. Thorin suspected they were about him, in his worst moments. Bilbo told him it was exactly this martyr complex that made Bilbo hesitant to confess the specifics of his dreams to his husband, lest Thorin find a way that a vision of Bilbo wandering naked through the main street of Hobbiton as his teeth fell out was somehow a hidden indictment of how Thorin never should have sent Bilbo in to speak to Smaug alone. In Erebor, they had had separate bedrooms. That had not inherently been a bad idea. But that didn't mean they didn't enjoy the nights they did share, warts and all. The inconvenience of sharing your bed could even, in a way, be a point. The person you loved was this sweltering lump taking up 2/3 of the bed, and they even managed to love you as you snored so loudly the rafters threatened a cave-in. Thorin was dressed in the nightgown his sister had sewn for him, had left at Bag End, lovingly waiting for him. As Bilbo cooked dinner tonight, Thorin had written her. For an hour he labored over a letter that ended up being about 4 lines long. The words "thank you" and "I love you" didn't take up too much space. As far as sentiments went, they were so overdue that Thorin didn't think he'd earned the right to disguise them in anything else. There was so much more that Thorin needed to say that he didn't even bother. If he tried to say everything, he would say nothing. Some things would have to wait. Thorin ended his letter to his sister with an invitation to return to the Shire whenever she was able. He would be happy to accept her abuse in person. As Thorin climbed into bed, the letter to Ch11 was still unfinished. Thorin had never actually written a letter to Ch11 that wasn't strictly related to business, politics, or war. Everything they needed to say to each other, they said in person. And usually they didn't end up saying anything at all. Thorin had asked Bilbo what he ought to write to his best friend, and Bilbo had rolled his eyes lovingly and said, "Why don't you just write what's happened that you think Ch11 would be interested in? You can start there." Thorin had started there, and he'd written 5 pages before Bilbo told him that he was going to bed. it turned out when Thorin sat down and thought about it. There was a lot in Thorin's new life that would interest Ch11. The letter to his nephews was still unstarted. That would take longer. Words would always be inadequate there. He had abandoned them to responsibility they ought to have grown into. They would be well within their rights to never forgive him for that. They would, of course, Bilbo had assured him, if they hadn't already. Thorin conceded that he knew that as well, which somehow only made him more annoyed on their behalf. But still, Bilbo would help him write that letter tomorrow. And tomorrow Thorin would head over to the farmland where he had released his raven. He would woo him back. He would apologize profusely to the farmers for inflicting this dwarven hell-beast upon their crops. Then he'd send what he had. Maybe one of Primula's or Drogo's letters as well. Maybe he'd ask Erebor if they could spare another raven for his friends. They were good people and deserved to bypass a postal system that seemed as reliable for long-distance messages as tossing your mail into a stiff breeze heading the right direction. Maybe Erebor could spare a couple ravens. After all, as Bilbo had pointed out, if they wanted to keep up their relationships with their loved ones in Erebor, they were going to need to send a hell of a lot of letters. It was 10 o'clock in bed, and Bilbo was half asleep, curled away from Thorin as Thorin read by the light of a candle on the bedside table that he'd bought in town last week. Bilbo's manuscript for his next edition of A Hobbit's Tale was spread in Thorin's lap. It had a new title, or an old title, depending on how you looked at it. Bilbo was going back to his original idea, there and back again, with an expanded appendix on the rebuilding of Erebor. I gave up on trying to make the rebuilding part of the narrative itself, Bilbo had said to Thorin earlier this evening when he'd handed over the nearly completed draft. It didn't work with the narrative structure. The story never seemed to end.
Yes, that is rather what it felt like, Thorin had replied. Being king through the reconstruction did in fact feel like being the main character of a textbook's endnotes.
You know, if you'd said a few more things like that while it was actually happening, and then gone, "No, really, Bilbo, I truly mean it," said Bilbo, "we might have avoided quite a lot of this fuss in the first place." The first half of the book was more or less the same, although the section with him finding the ring was a little different. Thorin had asked, frowning,
Did you rob this poor creature of its prized possession? I thought he gave it to you.
To which Bilbo had replied,
Please do not take his side.
He was going to eat me. It was the second half of the book where the new material truly began. There was appendix on Erebor, yes, that consigned the work of years into neat paragraphs that bemoaned their own dullness. But then there was the other section, the one that Bilbo said he wasn't sure what he'd do with, if he'd keep it or leave it out. It was the story of Bilbo's waiting, from the moment he awoke in the Shire, lost out of time and sure that the quest had not even begun, through Thorin's arrival.
When did you write this last part?
Thorin had asked, the ecstasy of the words so humbling he could hardly read them.
Over the last week,
Bilbo had smiled.
I may have been cross at you, but that doesn't mean I don't remember the sheer joy of seeing you again. I don't think I could ever forget that.
Bilbo wrote about Diaz. Bilbo wrote about Dwalin. Bilbo wrote about Tauriel, who told him about Gilly, who told him about Erebor. Thorin read it all, lying there in bed next to him. When his hands shook turning the page, Bilbo reached over without looking up from his own book to squeeze Thorin's arm. Comfort and privacy all in one gesture. The book was good. The book was very good. It had been good in its first edition, and it was good in its second. It was a horrible history, an account written by a fiction writer who never saw much reason not to say it was a dark and rainy night, if that was clearly the setting that ought to have been, if the universe would have just been on its game. But it was a fantastic novel. And what was more, Thorin enjoyed reading it. He couldn't have said that about the first time through. A year into his reign in Erebor. A year into the realization that he still wasn't satisfied. Back then, Bilbo's book seemed almost like a taunt.
Look at everything you did to get here, and you don't even want it.
But lying in his marriage bed, his husband dozing beside him, Thorin read the tale of his own quest and didn't recognize any of it. And not just because of Bilbo's liberal approach to the facts. Thorin read the tale of someone else. It wasn't him. The Thorin in the book had Thorin's name, had Thorin's history, had Thorin's family. But he wasn't the same Thorin who read his exploits today. The Thorin he read about never could have lived in the Shire. The Thorin he read about never could have married. It was strange to know that you have changed so much that the person you once were would neither recognize nor like you. It was strange, but it wasn't bad. The Thorin Bilbo had met had been angry, wrathful, bitter, ashamed. And the Thorin today carried his old self with him. But he didn't wear that skin anymore. Loving Thorin had made Bilbo the kind of person who could live in Erebor. Loving Bilbo had made Thorin the kind of person who could live in the Shire. That seemed right. That seemed unfair.
But then again, I always wanted a home at the end of exile, and Bilbo, always running off for adventure, had just been waiting for something to push him out the door. Maybe loving each other didn't change us at all. Maybe it just brought us back to the place where we started, before we complicated our lives so much we forgot the shape of our own desires.
Thorin closed up the book and put it on the table. He leaned over to blow out the candle. Then he stopped. The candle flickered from his breath as he thought. He thought the kind of sudden fancy that never grew so fast, nor seized so hard as it did at the dark times of the night, when there was no possibility of the immediate acting upon it. The fancy being, at the moment, unrealizable. It flourished. Dreams grow best in the hazy moments before sleep. Some strike so powerfully that sleep gets banished. Thorin thought and thought and thought. His thoughts looked something like,
No. But, no. However, it's impossible. So was reclaiming Erebor, if we're going to argue impossibilities. And see how well that went. Why, it went very well, thank you. Or is there not a kingdom under the mountain once more? What triumph you had in Erebor, you destroyed by leaving. So is that really the case study you want to use here? Yes, actually, I do. Because, damn it, I did get the mountain back, and I ruled it for 5 years. And that was more than anyone said I could ever do. And when I was done with that, I saved the life of the person I love the most. And none of that is something I ought to be ashamed of. Ah, but you are ashamed of it. Well, yes, but that doesn't mean I should be. Go to sleep, you daft idiot. When you wake up in the morning, you'll see this passing fancy for the nonsense that it is. That's precisely why I don't want to sleep. Thorin, don't Thorin me. We're both Thorin. I come up with the mad plans. You tell me not to do them. We do them anyway. And you yell at me when I'm done. Yes. But I'd like to point out that it's my mad plans that get things done. Yes, they get many things done. Shall I name the many things you have certainly got done? No need. The long list of shame is already running in the background. Goldsick, set Smog upon Lake Town, never told Wherein I loved him, still have not found father, clearly have a favourite nephew, Bilbo nearly died in Erebor for me, and because of me, abandoned Philly to be king because I was weak, do not deserve the friendship and love offered my way, stole Diaz's favourite toy and blamed it on a servant, people starved in exile, and I could have done more. Oh, I hate that list. I do too. But at least it's far, far quieter than it used to be. We can do this. Oh, but do we want to do this? Well, the question is if Bilbo wants to do this. No, actually, I think the question is, do we?
You purse your lips and blow, Bilbo murmured from his side of the bed. Thorin twisted his head towards his husband.
Sorry, what? To extinguish the candle flame.
Bilbo had only one eye open, and only barely now, squinting at Thorin in the dimness of the room.
I thought you'd forgot, since you've been staring at it for the past few minutes.
Thorin looked back at the candle. Then he looked back at Bilbo. Then back at the candle. Then Thorin leaned back against the headboard of the bed, the flame still flickering.
I want to talk to you.
Bilbo, both eyes closed now, smiled ruefully into his pillow.
Because that is what our day has lacked.
He shook himself and rose somewhat, his head propped up on his fist like he couldn't support it on his own.
Is there something else you've thought about? Something else that's been worrying you?
That I've been worrying you with went unsaid but understood, and Thorin shook his head vigorously.
No, not at all. No more forgiveness.
When Bilbo looked at him stunned, Thorin quickly clarified.
And no more apologies. Neither of us need offer either, simply because we feel we are not as happy as we ought to be. Bilbo, I've been thinking, right now, and this might be nothing more but another in a long string of mad plans I ought not to have done. But there is no one more qualified to handle my bouts of planning than you.
Bilbo sat up a little higher in bed at that.
Thorin, what on earth is it?
For a second, Thorin thought about thinking this through. Fortunately, his mouth worked faster than his brain.
We can go back to Erebor.
Bilbo stared at him the same way he'd stared at Thorin the first time he'd been in Bag End, and proposed a journey to Erebor.
Did you miss every conversation that we had this afternoon? That wasn't a conversation.
Thorin puffed himself up.
That was fatal defeatism. We do not brook with such things. Who are we, Bilbo? We are kings of the mountain.
Bilbo kept staring at him. Thorin begrudgingly added,
I am metaphorically these days, but still.
Thorin was one of those abominable people who refused to remember that bemused did not actually mean confused amusement. Bilbo was bemused in the classical sense right now, while Thorin found himself bemused in the correct sense. He was confused. He was amused. He didn't know exactly what he was saying, but he was having a great time. There was no giddiness on earth like that of the late-night, life-changing inspiration. Thorin laughed, drunk on moonshine streaming in through the window. His years in Erebor, he had missed the moon terribly.
We'll go back to Erebor, and we'll go every other place as well.
Bilbo tilted his head, a question in his eyes. Or maybe several questions in his eyes. A lot more questions than you might think would fit in reasonable-sized eyes. Thorin grabbed Bilbo's thigh, which, Bilbo was right, did have some good walking muscle on there. He did feel healthy. He did feel strong.
We go to Erebor until you are too sick to stay, and then we hurry back to the Shire, Thorin said. We wait in the Shire until you are well, then we hurry back to Erebor. That was the plan. But what if... Look!
And Thorin hopped to his feet and ran out of the bedroom. He had grabbed what he needed in the study when he turned around and saw Bilbo standing in the doorway, wrapped in the blanket. Thorin raised the map he'd come for.
I was heading back to bed. Oh yes, you made that very clear when you dashed out.
Bilbo had brought the candle with him, and he went around lighting the lamps around the study. The bay windows behind the table looked out into the blackness of night. The dark made the glass a mirror, and Thorin watched Bilbo's reflection sow firelight like seeds. Thorin put the map back on the table and smoothed it flat. The distance between the Shire and Erebor was traversed in one pass on his hand. The journey was nothing, too short even to be interesting. Bilbo could walk with true silence when he wanted. Thorin neither heard nor saw Bilbo arrive just behind his shoulder. He knew his husband was there when he leaned his cheek against Thorin's arm.
This was our path,
Thorin said, tracing the long months of the journey with one finger.
We took it because it was the fastest way for a small troop to get from here to there.
And because half the forces of evil in this world chased us onto our route.
Yes, true. There was some necessary compensation in our route to account for events, but it is overall a direct route. We saw truly very little of what Middle-earth has to offer. You know this. That's why you wanted to see more of it.
Bilbo leaned over the map, wrapping the blanket tighter around him. I did also want to take a more leisurely stroll through the places we sprinted through, but yes, I did want to see more as well. He couldn't keep the interest from his voice, even as he shot Thorin a worried look.
So we'll see more.
Thorin traced his finger north from the Shire, then south, then west, south, north, east, a zigzag through the cartography.
If the commute to Erebor is a hitch in the plan, then we won't make it a commute. It'll be a journey on which Erebor is one of any number of things that we will see. What do you want to see?
Bilbo stared at him.
Fangorn Forest? It's there. We can go, if you've such a dreadful desire. Or do you want to see the Minas Tirith, the White City of Gondor? I went there with my father when we were seeking out a refuge for our people. I know the way. Have you any interest in other dwarven kingdoms? Moria awaits, and they'd receive you with the honour you are due.
Thorin thought a moment and conceded.
Elves exist as well, I suppose, but the world is large, vaster than you can imagine, Bilbo.
Bilbo tore his eyes from the map. They found Thorin, staring into him with a strange fire. His brow furrowed.
But you don't want to wander?
Thorin did not think that Bilbo had intended it to come out as a question.
You travelled the Shire anew when you came back, Thorin said, and even though the familiarity of it was the antithesis of what you wanted, you still found it beautiful, familiar and strange all at once, and you said you could love it without reservation. If you only knew that this wasn't going to be the only wonder you got to see for all your days. If being here hadn't meant that you'd had your adventure and now it was time to settle. Bilbo, I spent my life in exile, trying to get home. And in exile, the land around me was nothing except what I didn't want to see. It was never very beautiful. It was never familiar. It was always just a reminder of the duty I owed my people. I did not travel. I endured. And I did not wander. I trudged from one place I needed to be to another. I thought I would never want to leave Erebor.
Regret flickered through Thorin. He let it flicker, and then did his best to let it go.
And then I thought, well, all right, I did want to leave Erebor, but I'll never want to leave the Shire.
He shook his head.
And to tell the truth, I don't want to leave the Shire. This land, its people. Bilbo, for all the flaws I know you see, that I know exist, the Shire is so beautiful that I don't understand how such a place can be.
Thorin reached up and stroked Bilbo's chin with a quiet smile.
But, love, I've never seen the world, he said solemnly. I walked through it, but I never saw it. And I think if I showed it to you, I'd see it too.
In the soft candlelight of the room, Bilbo glowed. He was beautiful, every bit as beautiful as the Shire. Thorin could hardly stand to look at him, and he stared at Thorin as if Thorin were mad. Thorin laughed, which probably didn't help his case, but he couldn't help it. The plan was mad. Thorin knew that. Mad, ridiculous, impossible. Maybe that was why it felt so right. And Erebor? Bilbo asked. That punctured his joy, but just for a moment. Thorin looked at the desk where he had written his letter this evening. The pages still spread for the ink to dry. He read his own words, his own missives and explanations and apologies to the people on this earth he held most dear. His sister ruled in one mountain, his nephew ruled in another, and his people lived divided between the two. And standing here above the lines of shame that he had finally bled out, Thorin missed them. He missed them terribly, and he missed them all.
Maybe you were right,
Thorin said, and turned around to face Bilbo, who watched him with careful eyes and careful hope.
Maybe I am the dramatic one in this relationship.
Thorin shrugged carelessly.
I suppose it is a tad hysterical to abandon Erebor forever just for the sake of a neat ending.
Bilbo burst into laughter.
Yes! Heavens, yes, you daft fool!
He said, as Thorin grinned and pulled him close.
Yes, it is.
Bilbo kept laughing as he wrapped his arms around Thorin, the blanket hanging off him like wings.
The mountain and the adventure and the hearth and the home, he said. I suppose Lobelia was right. I am selfish enough to want it all.
Then we'll have it all,
Thorin said, and Bilbo kissed him. They'd talk about it more in the morning. That was what they agreed, conscious of the giddiness like alcohol that ran through them. Conscious that perhaps this is the sort of thing that ought to be discussed in detail. There was the matter of when, for one. If they were to leave, then when?
Tomorrow,
Thorin said as they climbed into bed. Next year, Bilbo rebutted, lying down beside him. He nestled so deeply in that Thorin remembered that he had nearly been asleep before Thorin dragged him up.
Next year? But we've so much to see.
I know, and I want to leave instantly to see it. But you don't. And Thorin didn't.
Next year,
Bilbo sleepily concluded.
It'll be no hardship to stay while we make plans. The Shire's the most wonderful land in the world, after all.
Oh, is it now?
Thorin said with a grin.
Is talking about leaving all it takes to make you love it again? Maybe we'll never have to leave.
Bilbo grunted into his pillow. Thorin kissed his husband on his forehead. His skin was warm, not flushed, and his sleep was gentle, not unshakable. Thorin kissed him again and said a prayer that their gamble was right, that wandering wouldn't kill him, and therefore them both. But suffocation would too, and stagnation was its own torture. Tomorrow, then. They'd figure it all out tomorrow.
"And we'll invite Rothbart over for dinner tomorrow,"
Thorin said.
"so long as we're staying."
Bilbo groaned into his pillow.
"Oh, never mind. We leave the Shire now." "My grumpy hermit husband, how will you endure?"
Thorin teased.
"Come now, I'm willingly throwing myself into homelessness again. I think you'll find yourself capable of small talk."
Bilbo nearly set sails into the waters of sleep, found it in himself to stick his oar in the beach a moment longer to snort derisively.
"Please, you're hardly committing to homelessness,"
Bilbo said.
"My sacrifice is far greater."
Thorin laughed and this time kissed Bilbo's cheek.
"I commit myself to a life of exile for you."
You just gave me a speech about how you wanted this as well.
"And this is the thanks I get. I see how it is, Master Burglar. I see how it is."
"Oh, so do I, Thorin. A life of exile. Ha! Erebor is your home, and Bag End is your home. You'll never be in exile any more because you're always where you belong. You're never leaving anywhere whenever you step out the door. You're always heading home." Bilbo nestled deeper into his pillow.
"And I suppose the road could be a home as well, if we made it one. I can't imagine it wouldn't be one if we travelled it together."
On his side of the bed, Thorin sat very still. Bilbo reached up to tug on Thorin's beard.
"Go to sleep, dear,"
he said softly.
"The world and our neighbours wait for us tomorrow."
Thorin let himself be tugged until his head lay cradled in the pillow, close enough to Bilbo that their noses brushed. He could see the moment Bilbo fell asleep. The Hobbit twitched, a little tremor from head to toe, and when he settled, his body was stiller than it ever was before. His mouth drooped open. There was a good chance of drool that Thorin found comforting. Bilbo had never drooled when he was sick. He'd never kicked either. In many ways, Bilbo had been an easier bedmate when he'd been dying. Thorin could have watched him all night. Or he thought he could have, anyway. As it was, he lasted about 5 minutes. The bed was soft. The world was soft. The world was waiting, and theirs, and home. It was the kind of wild thought you could only think in the moments before sleep, in the dark where everything was possible. But he thought that it might just stand up to sunlight. Thorin closed his eyes and let Bilbo lead him on his way once more. To be concluded in Chapter 12.
Thank you for reading.
Please drop by the archive
and let the author know what you thought of their work.